Lecture 6, Mona Lisa Theft, 1911, Paris. In 1911, the painting that will later shut down entire museum wings and make tourists cry in front of bulletproof glass is just a moderately famous rectangle of wood in a busy room. The panel is roughly 7 to 7 centimeters high, 53 wide, and about a centimeter thick, a poplar board that at normal timber density weighs only a few kilograms, less mass than a loaded backpack. It hangs in the salon car of the Louvre's Denon wing, high up on the right bank of the Seine, between a Correggio and a Titian, framed in gilded wood and fronted since about 1909 by a sheet of protective glass. The French call her La Joconde, after Lisa del Giocondo's married name, but in 1911 she shares celebrity status with the Venus de Milo and the Winged Victory of Samothrace. Guidebooks list her as one highlight among many, not the pilgrimage end boss. The object's physics are boringly practical: a wooden support that swells with humidity, warps if the back dries faster than the front, and can be lifted by a single adult without grunting. The interesting part is invisible: the fact that by the early 20th century, several centuries of royal ownership, revolutionary nationalization, art historical reverence, and postcard reproduction have compressed millions of francs worth of symbolic value into a surface area smaller than a coffee table. Roll backwards for centuries and that pressure hasn't yet built. Around 1503, Leonardo da Vinci starts painting a portrait in Florence, probably of Lisa Gherardini, wife of silk merchant Francesco del Giocondo, on a poplar plank of the kind carpenters churn out by the cartload. He reworks it obsessively. Contemporaries like Giorgio Vasari, writing by the 1550s, already single out its uncanny skin tones and the sitter's strange, half-private smile. When Leonardo accepts Francis I's invitation and moves to France in the 1510s, he brings several paintings with him, including this one, and dies at Amboise in 1519 under royal protection. The portrait enters the French royal collections at Fontainebleau, shifts between palaces as dynasties come and go, and survives regime change not because it is priceless, but because it is portable and someone always bothers to write it on the inventory. After the Revolution, when the Louvre Palace becomes the Muséum Central des Arts in 1793 and then the Musée du Louvre, La Joconde migrates from private gallery to public display. 19th century poets and symbolist writers start fetishizing her. Cheap engravings and later half-tone photographs push her image into newspapers and tourist albums. Railway timetables let British and American visitors plan a half-day detour to see her on the way between Notre Dame and the Follies Burger. Fame accumulates very slowly, like soot on a ceiling. By the turn of the 20th century, that soot has become money, at least on paper. The Mona Lisa is not insured at some neat, official figure in 1911, but dealers and journalists treat her as a national treasure that would fetch an unprecedented price if she ever hit an auction block, which, legally, she cannot. When the painting finally travels abroad in 1962-63, on a heavily guarded tour to Washington and New York, she is assessed for insurance at about $100 million, the highest valuation ever given to a painting and still a Guinness record. Take that mid-century number and project it backwards and you get a sense of how violently the economics outrun the physics. A board with an area of about 4,000 square centimeters suddenly implies tens of thousands of dollars per square centimeter, more per gram than high-grade gold and competitive with good diamonds. And yet the mechanical problem of moving it remains school science fair level: lift, carry, pivot through a doorway whose width exceeds 53 centimeters, avoid sharp impacts and humidity spikes. Concentrated value is just the ratio between what the world would lose if the object vanished and how much effort it takes to warp that object to a different room. For La Joconde in 1911, that ratio is already ridiculous. Ask the Louvre's leadership how they intend to protect that ratio, and the first line of defense they describe is not a lock or a patrol route. It is a story. The Louvre is a former royal palace turned temple of the Republic, occupying a medieval to Napoleonic agglomeration of stone whose walls are meters thick at the base. Its director in 1911, Théophile Homel, born in 1848, is a classical archaeologist and epigrapher by training, an expert in Greek inscriptions, not key control systems. He is widely reported to have waved off concerns about serious theft with a line that journalists will gleefully recycle after the disaster: stealing the Mona Lisa, he suggests, would be like stealing the towers of Notre Dame. The arts minister responsible for France's national collections is no more anxious. While on holiday he reportedly instructs his staff not to disturb him unless the Louvre burns or La Joconde disappears, combining in one sentence a catastrophic fire scenario and the theft that everyone agrees is essentially unimaginable. The security model here is metaphysical: nobody would dare, everybody is watching, Paris as a whole would rise up if someone tried. The actual system is much more threadbare. In 1911, entry to the Louvre is free, a point of Republican pride. National patrimony belongs to the people, so the people should walk in without paying. The guard corps is small, attendants posted in galleries serve simultaneously as room-level security, descent, and human furniture, expected to discourage touching and smoking more than to foil an organized heist. Doors are locked at night, but the keys live in pockets and drawers rather than in anything we would recognize as access control. Windows are closed, but not wired to alarms. There are no cameras, no motion detectors, no glass break sensors, no inventory system linked to physical exits. Paintings come down from walls for cleaning, reframing, or photography, are stacked temporarily in corridors or stairwells, and go back up when someone decides it's time. The paperwork, when it exists, is departmental and ad hoc. If you ask a curator in August 1911 to list which canvases are physically hanging where, the answer is a set of confident generalities and a shrug, not a database. The institution relies on etiquette. Visitors keep their distance because they are in a palace, staff behave because they are gentlemen. The idea that someone might treat the place like a target rather than a shrine feels, to the people in charge, like a category error. That mythology extends to the daily and weekly rhythms of the building. The Louvre closes to the public 1 day per week, Monday, to allow for dusting, rehanging, and repair work. On paper this looks like a risk reduction measure: fewer people in the galleries, fewer chances for accidents, more time for conservation. In practice, Monday simply swaps one kind of crowd for another. Cleaners arrive with buckets and rags, carpenters haul ladders and planks, photographers wheel carts of equipment to the rooftop studio where they make reproductions for catalogues, glaziers and framers carry panes of plate glass and armfuls of moldings. Guards recognize many of these workers by sight and by their white smocks, but there is no modern notion of a badged population. Contractors come and go through side entrances because a concierge has seen them before, or because they are clearly carrying tools. No one is counting heads against a roster. No one is reconciling paintings taken down in the morning with paintings back on the walls at dusk. Monday, in other words, is the day when the museum touches its own collection the most, while watching itself the least. Viewed from the outside, the building looks impregnable. The Louvre's bulk stretches along the Seine with a sequence of courtyards: Cour Carré, Cour Visconti, the Cour Napoleon, enclosed by facades studded with columns and sculpture. The Denon wing, where the Salon car sits, rises above the river on thick masonry. The great staircase nearby leads up to the long Grande Gallery and down toward the main entrance. From the Pont du Carrousel or the Tuileries Gardens, what you see is an almost continuous stone wall, punctured by tall windows too high for a ladder and guarded at ground level by massive doors. This is the image that comforts administrators: a fortress shell wrapped around France's artistic loot. Inside that shell, however, the layout is more like a maze someone has been improvising for 3 centuries. Corridors kink and double back, short flights of steps connect slightly offset floors, service staircases like the September meters zigzag between levels that tourists never see. There is no simple perimeter between outside and inside. There are layers of increasingly obscure inside, each populated by people who belong there for some reason that would be very hard to reconstruct after the fact. Now add time to the layout. On an ordinary open day in 1911, thousands of visitors pass through the building, Parisians killing an afternoon, provincial families in their Sunday best, foreigners who have arrived by train from London, Berlin, or New York. They fan out into the Italian painting rooms, bottleneck at the Winged Victory, drift through the Salon car. Guards get used to scanning the crowd rather than scrutinizing any particular individual. The threat model in their heads is pickpockets among tourists, not a worker calmly unhooking a masterpiece. On Mondays, by contrast, the flows narrow and intensify, fewer bodies overall, but a far higher percentage of them with keys, tools, or practical access to walls and frames. Doors that are firmly locked on Sundays may be propped open to allow a cleaner to pass with a mop bucket or a photographer with a tripod. From a security engineering perspective, this looks like an attack surface blooming: more legitimate reasons for people to be in odd places, more plausible pretexts for carrying objects, fewer neutral observers. But the people operating the system are not thinking in those terms. They are thinking in terms of politeness, hierarchy, and habit. The larger city reinforces that complacency even as it supplies new ways to exploit it. Belle Époque Paris in 1911 is a metropolis of nearly 3 million residents, lit by electric street lamps and stitched together by the metro, electric trams, and dense railway networks. International expositions in 1889 and 1900 have advertised the capital's modernity to tens of millions of visitors. The Eiffel Tower still broadcasts, "We are the future," from the Champ de Mars. Illustrated newspapers like Le Petit Parisien and L'Illustration run front-page engravings of sensational crimes and back-page advertisements for cameras, rail tickets, and cheap reproductions of famous paintings. Postcards of La Joconde sell along the Rue de Rivoli for a few centimes. Tourists who have never read Vasari recognize her face from shop windows. At the same time, the Paris police under Prefect Louis Lepine are experimenting with cutting-edge forensic tools, Bertillon's anthropometric measurements, standardized mugshots, and the still new practice of fingerprinting. The city, in other words, is perfectly capable of tracking a person's body in great detail once they are a suspect. What it has not yet learned to do is track an object as it moves from one wall to another before anyone realizes they should be suspicious. Inside the Louvre, administrative priorities lag behind all that technical swagger. Budgets from the Ministry of Fine Arts favor visible improvements, new galleries, better lighting, prestigious acquisitions, over invisible measures like staff vetting, alarm wiring, or inventory audits. The museums catalogue records which paintings the institution owns, with as much scholarly metadata as curators can amass, but the day-to-day question, is this object physically here, is left to memory and routine. Attendants are hired more for their respectability and willingness to wear a frock coat than for any specialized security training. Contractors are paid by the job, not subjected to background checks. When a painting leaves its wall, the implicit assumption is that some responsible person asked for it and that it will eventually return. The gap between the story, the Louvre's impenetrable temple of culture, and the actual control graph of people, doors, and objects is large enough to drive a horse-drawn cart through. From a distance of more than a century, it is tempting to narrate what happens next as the work of a singular mastermind, a once-in-history genius who outwitted the French state. The more you look at the system, though, the less genius you need. You have an object whose economic and symbolic weight is out of all proportion to its mass, a leadership that treats theft as a joke about cathedral towers, a building whose interior is a thicket of unmonitored passageways, and a weekly schedule that creates long stretches when people with tools can go almost anywhere without being questioned. The puzzle practically invites someone to test it. At some point, a short man in a white work coat is going to stop seeing the Mona Lisa as an untouchable icon and start seeing her as what she also is, a flat board on four metal supports, in a room that sometimes empties out, in a palace that has convinced itself it cannot be robbed. When he reaches the Mona Lisa that Monday morning, the room is so underpopulated it might as well be a private studio. It is sometime between 7:15 and 7:30 a.m. on the 21st of August, 1911. The salon car is closed to the public, lit by a grey Paris sky and a few electric bulbs, and the painting hangs on four metal pegs driven into the masonry. The panel itself is small, about 77 by 53 centimeters, poplar only a centimeter or so thick, mounted inside a wooden case with a sheet of protective glass that Perugia himself helped install in 1910. He has a flathead screwdriver in his pocket, a white cotton smock over his work clothes, and years of muscle memory for lifting rectangles off walls without dropping them. No one has logged any movement order for this painting, no one has put a guard in front of it. To the museum, it is just another object on the Monday cleaning schedule. To the man in the smock, it is a portable solution to several problems at once: money, status, revenge. The first mechanical step is embarrassingly simple. He lifts the whole box, frame, glass, and panel, straight up off its pegs. The case weighs far more than the naked painting, thanks to the thick glass and the carved Renaissance frame, but he has carried comparable loads for the glazing firm Gobier. Instead of fiddling in the open gallery, he walks a few meters to the door of the Escalier des Septembre meters, a narrow service stair that links the salon car to the courtyard level. That stairwell is almost never seen by visitors. It is where staff leave ladders, packing crates, and frames when a room is being rehung. On a Monday, it is as close as the Louvre comes to a blind corner. He slips inside, props the case against the wall on the first landing, and sets to work. Screws come out first, then small nails. The glass front lifts away, heavy and unforgiving, to be leaned against the wall. The panel emerges from its own armor like a wafer from a box. He hides the empty frame and glass behind stacked crates, knowing that when someone finds them later the only thing they will confirm is that the object is gone. Freed from its case, the painting becomes manageable in a way no security report has accounted for. A poplar board of that size is only a few kilograms of wood plus paint and varnish. One arm can hold it comfortably if you do not mind the edges biting into your palm. Perugia is short, around 1.60 m in his boots, and when he later tells police he tried to hide the painting under his smock, you can reconstruct the geometry. A 77 centimeter panel does not disappear under the coat of a 160 man without creating a very obvious rectangular hunchback. So he changes tactic. He takes off the smock entirely, wraps it around the panel like butcher paper around a cut of meat, and cradles the bundle against his chest. To anyone who glances briefly into the stairwell, he is just another worker carrying a mysterious but not implausible package towards some backstage corner of the palace. Museums in 1911 are full of such bundles, nobody catalogues the wrapping. The next problem is a door latch. The stair opens onto a small vestibule leading to a side courtyard, the Cour Visconti. On ordinary workdays, the door to that courtyard is unlocked by early morning so staff can move equipment in and out. On this particular Monday it is still bolted from the outside when he reaches it, sometime around 7:50 a.m., and he suddenly finds himself in a narrow box, gallery stairs behind him, courtyard ahead, panel in his arms, no obvious way forward. Architecturally, the door is straightforward, a latch mechanism controlled by a spindle that runs through the wood, a knob on each side, and a metal escutcheon plate. He removes the inner knob and plate with his screwdriver in a few seconds, reducing the hardware to a bare square spindle poking through the lock. That still does not retract the latch, it only exposes the interface that needs turning. What he cannot supply from inside is the hand on the other side. The hand shows up in the form of a plumber. Around 8 o'clock a.m., a man named Sauvé, sources differ on his exact spelling, walks through the courtyard and notices, through the window, a colleague in a white smock apparently stuck behind a stubborn door, holding a detached knob like a broken tooth. In every account, Sauvé's reasoning is exquisitely mundane: doors stick, workers swear, one helps. He uses whatever is to hand, a small wrench, a pair of pliers, or his key, to grip the exposed spindle from the courtyard side and twist. The latch snaps back, the door swings open. Between them, without a word about art or crime, they have just defeated the Louvre's entire perimeter. Sauvé even helps reattach the knob, restoring the facade of normality before walking away. Later, when police interview him, he insists he noticed nothing unusual, just a man in work clothes, a jammed door, and a minor repair. This is social engineering at its purest, exploiting the reflex to be helpful rather than any weakness in the metal. Once he is in the courtyard, the hardest part is over and nothing cinematic happens at all. He crosses the paving stones of the Cour Visconti, the panel still wrapped in its cotton shell, and heads towards one of the inner gates that leads to the street network along the Seine. There is no guard checking outbound parcels, no ledger where a supervisor signs off on objects leaving the building. The museum's control is temporal, doors closed at night, doors open during the day, not volumetric. Around 8:30 a.m., he likely emerges onto the Quai du Louvre, a quayside road busy with carts, early motorbuses, and pedestrians who are thinking about bread, wages, and newsprint, not about Renaissance portraiture. His rented room at 5, Rue de l'Hôpital Saint-Louis in the 10th arrondissement lies about 3 kilometers to the northeast. On foot, at a steady worker's pace, that is 40 minutes, faster with a tram or omnibus. Later gossip imagines him taking a taxi, but the most plausible scenario is also the dullest: a short Italian disappearing into the city with a rectangular bundle, one more tradesman carrying one more awkward item across town. Inside that room in the 10th, the transformation from object in national collection to awkward household possession is almost instantaneous. Boarding house rooms in 1911 Paris are small, often 10 or 12 square meters, with a bed, a table, a washstand, and not much else. The walls are thin, the air carries coal smoke and cooking smells from other tenants, and nobody has heard the phrase climate control. At some point that morning, or soon after, he slides the panel into a trunk or cupboard, improvising storage for a piece of wood that has crossed 4 centuries of French history to end up sharing floor space with boots and shirts. We will come back to the carpentry later. For now, it is enough to center the fact that by mid-morning the Mona Lisa is no longer in the Louvre, no longer in any official ledger, and no longer in anyone's risk model. It is in a cheap room in the 10th, and the museum has not yet noticed. Back at the palace, Monday unfolds as a maintenance day on autopilot. Cleaners mop marble, electricians check wiring, guards wander through partially closed galleries, their attention calibrated for visitors who are not there. The Louvre does not conduct full visual inventories on closure days. Paintings are regularly taken down for photography, rehanging, or minor repair with nothing more than a scribbled note in an office. The assumption on the floor is that any gap on a wall probably has paperwork behind it somewhere. At least one guard later recalls walking through the salon car on the 21st and seeing an empty space where the Mona Lisa usually hangs, but he assumes it has been taken to the photographer's studio and moves on. No one picks up a telephone, no one shouts. A system that depends entirely on someone deciding, this absence is weird, fails in exactly the way you would expect. Absence looks mundane until someone needs the thing. The alarm does not really begin to ring until the following morning, Tuesday the 22nd of August. Around 7, as the museum prepares to reopen to the public, a curator or senior guard making early rounds in the Italian gallery notices that the panel is still missing. He again defaults to the benign explanation that the painting is in the studio or workshop, and goes to check. The photographers say they have not had it. The restorers say the same. Somewhere in that sequence of denials, the mental switch flips from routine movement to "we have lost a Leonardo." At about 8:30 a.m., painter Louis Beroud arrives with a permit to copy the Mona Lisa, as he has done with other masterpieces. He sets up his easel, looks up, and finds his subject replaced by 4 bare metal pegs and a cleaner patch of wall. There is a moment of farce. He asks a guard to bring the painting back, as if it has gone to the equivalent of a backstage dressing room, and the guard goes off to fetch it. When no one can produce it from any conceivable closet, the farce goes sour. By late morning the salon car is sealed, the stairwell is being searched, and the director is being summoned from wherever one spends a late August morning when one believes thefts are impossible. The crime scene yields physical evidence faster than it yields understanding. In the Escalier des September meters, staff discover the heavy frame and the protective glass abandoned on a landing, exactly where Perugia left them. Police photographers record the scene, frame propped against stone, glass nearby, stairs curving sharply out of view, a chalk circle around a smudge on the wood. That smudge becomes a key exhibit. Under the direction of Alphonse Bertillon, the Paris police's evangelist for scientific identification, technicians dust the frame and glass, lift a clear right thumbprint, and transfer it to a card. In 1911, this is cutting-edge policing, measurements, indices, categories. The card is then compared against the prints of 257 current Louvre employees and contractors whose fingers have been dutifully inked for the occasion. The result comes back, no match, which is technically accurate and practically useless. The one card in the files that would have matched, Vincenzo Perugia, born in 1881, fingerprinted in 1909 for a minor offense, is not in the stack, because ex-employees are not considered. The system is not failing at the level of chemistry, it is failing at the level of the where clause. As technicians fuss over powders and magnifying glasses, detectives start mapping movements. They interview guards about who entered which doors on Monday, what time the cow of Visconti gate was opened, whether anyone saw a man with a suspicious parcel. The plumber is traced and questioned. He describes the jammed door, the missing knob, the helpful gesture with the spindle, and the fact that the man he helped wore the usual white smock and carried nothing remarkable. Investigators pace the distance from the stairwell to the courtyard, from the courtyard to the gate, from the gate to the street, timing themselves like slightly out-of-breath ghosts of the thief. They reconstruct a route they cannot populate with a name. The mechanical chain is clear: painting on wall, painting in box, box in stairwell, panel wrapped in cloth, door stuck, door opened by an unwitting accomplice. What they lack is the piece of the story that says, this sequence belongs to that specific person, even though his thumb is literally on their evidence. Because the theft happened on a closed day, suspicion initially collapses inwards, onto the staff. By the 24th of August, more than 60 officers from the Short and the Prefecture have been assigned to the case, an extraordinary deployment for a single missing object. Guards, cleaners, house painters, and contractors are hauled into interrogation rooms and asked to account for every minute of their Monday. Questioning in 1911 is not regulated the way you might hope. One young painter, grilled so aggressively that newspapers later report a suicide attempt, becomes an emblem of how badly the pressure is misdirected. The working assumption is that the thief must be a skilled insider, which is true, but the way that idea is operationalized is crude: lean on the most marginal employees until someone cracks. What no one does is ask whether the ex-workers, the men who know the building and no longer appear on any payroll list, should be part of the database and not just the rumor mill. The investigation does, briefly, brush against the truth and then walk away. In early September, detectives visit a boarding house on Rue de l'Hôpital St. Louis because the name, Perugia, shows up on a list of men who once worked on the Louvre glazing contract in 1909 to 1910. They climb the stairs, knock on the door of a small room, and find a compact Italian with an anxious politeness and halting French. He tells them he now works for another firm on the Champs-Élysées and has not set foot in the museum for months. They ask a few questions, glance around, and see nothing that screams, Da Vinci. One of them reportedly sits at a table or chest to write notes, a piece of furniture that also serves as the lid of the trunk where the painting lies under a thin layer of clothes and a false bottom of wood. The officers do not pry up panels, they do not search beyond what habit suggests. In their mental model, the missing painting is already far away, smuggled out of France in a crate or on a ship. The idea that it is within a meter of their ink pen does not occur to them. Outside the Louvre, the story explodes. On the 23rd of August, French papers run front-page headlines that might as well be parody if they were not true. On a vol la Joconde. They've stolen the Mona Lisa. Some print photographs of the empty space where the painting hung, bordered in black as if the blank patch of wall itself were in mourning. Across the Atlantic, the New York Times tells its readers, Mona Lisa stolen, Paris police baffled, and notes, with relish, that the Louvre's director once dismissed such a theft as impossible. Within 48 hours, people who have never stood in the Salon Car now know that somewhere in Paris there used to be a small portrait of a woman with folded hands and an ambiguous smile, and that it has vanished. This is new, not just a robbery at a museum, but a specific artwork becoming a global front-page character. The museum responds by doing something that feels safe and looks terrible: it closes. For about a week, the Louvre shuts its doors completely while police and staff search, argue, and draft statements. When it finally reopens, the public does not come primarily to see art. They come to see nothing. Contemporary estimates talk about tens of thousands of visitors filing through the Salon Car in late 1911, not to admire surviving Raphaels or Titians but to stare at 4 metal pegs and a lighter-colored rectangle of plaster. One eyewitness writes of joining numerous other curious visitors whose sole intent is to gaze at the absence. In perceptual terms, this is a bizarre laboratory experiment. You take an object that most people ignored, remove it, tell everyone it was important, and watch as absence becomes a spectacle. The blankness functions like an unintentional conceptual artwork, except the curators are mortified, the guards are exhausted, and the insurance lawyers are having a very bad month. Embarrassment, meanwhile, is converted into cash. Within days of the theft being confirmed, the Société des Amis du Louvre, the Friends of the Louvre, offers a reward of 25,000 francs for information leading to the painting, several years' salary for a guard. The Illustrated Weekly illustration raises the stakes with a 40,000 franc pledge if the work itself is returned intact. Prefect Louis Lepine has circulars sent to ports from Le Havre to Marseille and to railway stations en routes to Italy, Belgium, and Switzerland, instructing customs officers to keep an eye out. Because the museum has no high-quality official photograph on file, authorities rely on postcard reproductions and halftone images to show what the painting looks like, which is fine if you are trying to spot a general type and less fine if you are trying to distinguish an original from one of the many copies already circulating. On paper, this is the modernizing face of law enforcement, fingerprints, telegraphs, and international alerts. In practice, the signal-to-noise ratio is awful. Noise arrives in volume. Letters pour into the police and newspapers from citizens convinced they have seen the painting on a yacht in Monte Carlo, in a private club in New York, in the window of a suspicious antique shop in Brussels. Spiritualists write in claiming to sense the aura of La Joconde across great distances, often for a small fee. Most audaciously, opportunists send fake ransom demands. Honoré Guéry-Pirette, former secretary to the poet Guillaume Apollinaire and part-time thief of small Iberian statuettes, writes to Paris Journal claiming knowledge of the painting's fate and proposing terms. Another chancer demands 150,000 francs for information, a sum that would turn a working-class life inside out. Newspapers print some of these missives on front pages, half skeptical and half delighted. The pattern will be familiar to anyone who has watched internet trolls claim credit for a major hack. When the signal is strong enough, attention itself becomes a currency, and people will counterfeit it. The attention also drags in people who are genuinely famous, and not for burglary. Years before the theft, Apollinaire had declared in print that museums should be burned, a line that played as provocation and manifesto in the avant-garde circles of Montmartre. Around 1906 to 1907, his associate Pirette stole a handful of small Iberian stone heads from the Louvre and sold some of them to young painters, including a 25-year-old Spaniard named Pablo Picasso. On the 29th of August, 1911, after the Mona Lisa theft, Apollinaire arranges through Paris Journal to return 2 of those statuettes, hoping to clean up a minor old mess without attracting too much fire. Instead, he paints a target on his own back. When Pirette later goes to the same paper boasting about his thefts and hinting he might know something about the missing painting, police who are already primed to distrust bohemians do exactly what you would expect. They arrest the poet. On the 7th of September, Apollinaire is picked up and taken to Losanti prison on charges related to receiving stolen goods, technically the Iberian figurines but atmospherically the Mona Lisa. Interrogation transcripts show a mix of bravado and panic. Confronted with his "burn the Louvre" rhetoric, he insists he was joking, or at least theorizing, not issuing operational orders. He denies having any role in the 1911 theft, offers details of Pierrett's small-time pilfering in 1907, and tries to recast himself as a slightly foolish bystander rather than an accomplice. Under pressure, he mentions Picasso's name, dragging his friend into the vortex. Picasso, then 29 and not yet the global giant of Guernica and museum retrospectives, is summoned for questioning. One account has him so frightened that he initially denies even knowing Apollinaire, which would be like pretending in 1911 that you have never heard of Cubism while sitting in a Montmartre café full of it. Two of the century's most important artists spend several days worrying less about art history than about prison. Neither man is actually connected to the theft. The only proven crimes in their orbit are those little stolen heads, which sit uneasily in Picasso's studio and later in art historical footnotes. By the 12th of September, Apollinaire is released for lack of evidence tying him to the missing Leonardo. Charges related to the painting quietly evaporate. But as a narrative, the episode is irresistible. The man who wanted to torch museums, the painter who is reshaping how faces are painted, both briefly suspected of stealing the world's most famous face. Their misadventure reveals the investigation's bias in high relief. Instead of asking hard questions about key control, ex-employee lists, or the design of Monday patrols, authorities chase a story template: strange ideas plus strange friends equals strange crime. It is a classic case of threat modeling by aesthetics. By the end of that first month, the file is already thick: a fingerprint that matches no one on the current roster, a reconstructed route through a back stair and a courtyard, a helpful plumber's recollection, stacks of international telegrams, and pages of interviews with frightened workers and irritated poets. The painting itself, however, is not in Monte Carlo, New York, Brussels, or on a secret wall in a collector's chateau. It is in a boarding house room in the 10th arrondissement, shut away in a piece of furniture that police have already leaned on. The machinery of the state is running hot, printing circulars, paying informants, scouring borders, while the physical object at the center of the storm sits motionless in a trunk that has traveled exactly 3 kilometers from the salon car and stopped. For more than 2 years after the theft, the most closely watched painting in Europe lives the life of a cheap lodger. The panel, poplar, about 77 by 53 centimeters and barely a centimeter thick, moves from a climate-controlled Louvre gallery to a worker's room at 5 Rue de l'Hôpital Saint-Louis in Paris's 10th arrondissement, a block of the city that smells more of coal and cabbage than of old masters. The room is a single chamber: iron bed, chipped table, small stove, thin plaster walls, a trunk that doubles as wardrobe and, crucially, vault. The panel spends most of its exile inside that trunk, under a layer of clothes and a removable false bottom that turns 3 kilograms of Renaissance art into nothing to see here. Later police walkthroughs and trial testimony let investigators reconstruct the layout: where the trunk stood against the wall, how the false panel slid out, how much clearance the painting needed to sit flat. Conservators who study the case wince at the microclimate implied by those details: uninsulated walls, winter humidity swings, summer heat, coal smoke, cooking steam, because poplar moves with moisture, and a millimeter of warp over decades can crack paint that has taken 4 centuries to stabilize. From an operational standpoint, the hiding method is brutally simple and surprisingly effective. The trunk is not locked with an exotic mechanism, it is secured by social expectations. Any visitor to the room, landlady, neighbor, police officer, reads it as poor man's furniture, not as international contraband container. A proper search protocol in 1911 would have required opening containers, removing contents, tapping panels for hollows, but the Paris police are not in spy novel mode, they are in talk to likely witnesses mode. When they eventually come to question their former contract glazier that September, he is not high on the suspect list, he is one of many men on a roster of workers who had access to the salon car. They ask where he was, he produces an alibi about working elsewhere, they glance around a small, grimy room that matches his income, and they leave without asking the trunk to prove it has only one floor. In hindsight, the false bottom looks like genius. In real time, it is merely the simplest possible way to exploit an investigation that has not yet accepted somebody walked out with it as its primary hypothesis. Inside that room, the risk calculus shifts slowly and then all at once. On the day of the theft in August 1911, the panel in the trunk is a triumph, proof that the system was as porous as he thought, that a white smock and a screwdriver could humiliate the French state. By autumn, it is an object that narrows his life. He cannot invite friends home, he cannot move apartments without lugging 30 by 20 inches of damning evidence through the streets. He cannot even relax when there is a knock on the door because any inspection that gets to the second layer of the trunk will end the story. Meanwhile, outside the building, the case has become a continent-wide spectacle. Newspapers in Paris, London, New York run diagrams of the empty wall and reproduce grainy photographs of the portrait. Border posts have been alerted. Museums are suddenly checking frames that have not been touched in decades. Every headline he reads about new leads or false suspects is, mechanically, another line in the equation: how long can I keep this under my bed before probability catches up? His own paperwork shows that he does not intend to keep the painting indefinitely as a private devotional object. On the 22nd of December, 1911, barely 4 months after the theft, he writes to his father back in Jumenza, the village near Varese where he was born in 1881, and promises that, soon, with one stroke, our fortune will be made. The letter is intercepted years later when Italian police search his belongings. It ends up in the Florence court file and is read aloud to a packed courtroom in June 1914. Its evidentiary value is enormous. First, it timestamps his mindset. By late 1911 he already imagines a single dramatic cash event, not an indefinite patriotic guardianship. Second, the plural, our fortune, grounds the motive in family economics, the eternal migrant fantasy that one spectacular act abroad will convert humiliating labor into honorable return. Third, it preemptively contradicts the story he will later tell under oath about purely nationalistic motives. You do not usually write, our fortune, to your father if the plan is to hand a painting to the Italian state for a polite certificate of thanks. Led over that straightforward desire for money is a very specific misunderstanding of art history. When he later explains himself to Italian interrogators and then to a Florence jury, he insists that the painting had been stolen by Napoleon, and that he is merely taking back what was looted. The problem is that Leonardo da Vinci himself brought the panel to France around 1516, in his 60s, when he entered the service of King Francis I and settled at the Château du Clos-Luce in Amboise. By the time Napoleon is born in 1769, the picture has been French royal property for roughly 2.5 centuries. By the time it is hung in the Louvre in the 19th century, it is already woven into French museum identity. But in the popular Italian imagination of the early 20th century, any Renaissance masterpiece in Paris can be filed under Napoleonic plunder. Newspapers rail against wagonloads of altarpieces hauled across the Alps, pamphlets decry French pillage, schoolbooks simplify centuries of acquisition into a single villain with a bicorn hat. A house painter with a few years of schooling in Lombardy does not cross-reference this against Vasari and archival purchase records. He grabs the narrative that casts him as a small man avenging a big wrong and bolts it onto his very real envy of French wages. The result is a messy motive stack that does not fit easily into courtroom categories. On the one hand, we have the December 1911 letter, evidence of concrete financial fantasy. On the other, we have years of nationalist rhetoric about Italian art abroad, which he has absorbed in cafes, in emigrant conversations, in church sermons that mention our stolen patrimony. Add to this his work history, installing protective glass at the Louvre in 1910 for the firm Gobia, being addressed by French foremen by his first name while still feeling like an outsider, and you get a man who experiences both class resentment and cultural grievance. This hybrid motive is structurally important. It explains why he goes for a high-profile target rather than quietly lifting a smaller, more liquid painting. It explains why he hides the panel rather than immediately trying to chop it out of its frame and move it through the black market. And it explains why, when he finally does try to cash out, he aims at an Italian dealer rather than at some anonymous fence who does not care which flag once hung over the picture. 2 years is a long time for a poplar panel, but it turns out to be even longer for a thief with no fencing network. Professional art criminals think about the loot pipeline from the start: who pays, how they will be contacted, what jurisdictions are safest. In this case, the last step of the heist, the sale, is left to magical thinking. For much of 1912 and 1913, he appears simply to wait. He reads about the ongoing search in newspapers, he hears that the Louvre director has resigned in disgrace, he learns that avant-garde figures like Guillaume Apollinaire and Pablo Picasso have been hauled in for questioning. There is a grotesque disconnect between the scale of the manhunt, international alerts, fingerprint experiments, rumors of American millionaires, and the reality of a 30-something laborer sharing a room with the missing object. Risk, in that period, accumulates asymmetrically. For the police, every month without progress dulls the political urgency. For the man with the trunk, every month adds weight to the knowledge that if anyone unscrews that false bottom, his entire future collapses in the time it takes a constable to shout for handcuffs. The equilibrium finally shifts not because the police tighten the net, but because an Italian antiquarian buys advertising space. In late 1913, a Florence dealer named Alfredo Geri places a small notice in the Italian press seeking works of the Italian school, 16th century, especially Leonardo, for his gallery on Via Borgognasanti. The ad is meant for provincial families sitting on dusty canvases and parish priests tempted to monetize neglected church paintings. Instead, it is read, either in Paris, where Italian papers circulates among expatriates, or during a brief trip back across the Alps, by a man with a very specific Leonardo in his trunk. From an information security perspective, the advertisement is an unfiltered input channel into the legitimate art market. It tells owners of possibly looted or dubious works, here is a named dealer, in a fixed location, openly inviting contact. He writes to Geri under an alias, calling himself Leonard, or Leonard V, and claims to possess the original Mona Lisa removed from the Louvre. The letter, later preserved in police archives, is the textual twin of his 1911 note home, patriotic flourishes about returning an Italian treasure, threaded with hints that he expects substantial payment for his risky custodianship. Geri, reading this, is not charmed, he is alarmed. Florence in December 1913 is far enough from Paris that the theft has receded into background noise, but any dealer with a pulse remembers the front page photographs from 2 years earlier. There are two possibilities: this is a hoax, or it is an offer to fence the most famous missing painting on earth. Either way, he does not want to handle it alone. He shows the correspondence to Giovanni Poggi, the director of the Uffizi Gallery, who brings to the table decades of experience examining Renaissance panels and a keen awareness of diplomatic catastrophe. If they mishandle a genuine Mona Lisa, Florence risks being painted as the city that knowingly received stolen French property. They agree on a cautious strategy that reads like a risk management manual, invite the man to Florence, insist that the painting be brought to a controlled space, have Poggi there to authenticate, and, crucially, be ready to involve the police the moment the object shows any sign of being real. The stage is set for a sting, but neither Geri nor Poggi is willing to trigger it without hard physical evidence. Moving the painting from his Paris room to an Italian gallery turns out to be the least cinematic part of the story. In 1913, European rail networks are dense, and passport controls are still patchy. Border officials are more focused on taxable goods like tobacco and textiles than on small wooden boards. Sometime in early December, he strips the trunk down to its familiar configuration, ordinary clothes and tools on top, removable panel beneath, poplar board wrapped in cloth in the hollow. The dimensions of the panel make the carpentry straightforward, create a recess just over 77 by 53 centimeters, with a depth sufficient for the centimeter-thick board plus padding. The trunk is checked as personal luggage on trains that run southeast from Paris via Lyon and the Frejus rail tunnel toward Turin, Bologna, and finally Florence. Porters move dozens of such boxes every day, at 40 or so kilograms fully laden. His does not stand out. If a customs inspector lifts the lid, he sees exactly what he expects of an itinerant workman: shirts, perhaps some tools, maybe a folded smock. The painting remains invisible unless someone has both suspicion and a screwdriver, and no one does. When he walks into Geri's gallery on Via Borgognasanti, he is carrying the trunk himself, an oddly menial gesture for someone who imagines he is about to negotiate with the Italian art establishment. The shop layout is typical for the period: a narrow front room with glass cases and small objects, then a more solid back room with a sturdy table where larger works can be examined away from street eyes. Geri closes the doors. Poggi is there, having agreed to act as expert witness. The air, one imagines, is a mix of dust, oil varnish, and adrenaline. He insists on privacy and then performs the reveal he has rehearsed in his head for 2 years. The lock snaps open, the lid lifts, the false bottom slides aside, a wrapped board comes out, swaddled in red cloth. When the cloth is peeled away, the face that has been missing from Paris since August 1911, hands folded, distant landscape hazy with sfumato, that infuriating near smile, looks up at 2 Italian men whose professional lives revolve around exactly this kind of object. From that moment on, the drama belongs less to the thief than to the expert. Poggi's job is to decide, quickly and correctly, whether this is a 400-year-old panel or an enterprising forgery. He starts, of course, with the front, the subtle modeling around the eyes, the way the contours dissolve into shadow, the particular horizon line. But by 1913 enough copies of the Mona Lisa have been made that a skillful forger could, in theory, get the face mostly right. So Poggi flips the panel and reads the back the way you or I would read a passport. There is the grain of the poplar, matching descriptions in Louvre inventories. There are old wax seals and stamps indicating the French National Museums, not some random provincial collection. There are catalogue numbers that correspond to entries in Parisian records. He examines the craquelure, the network of microcracks in varnish and paint, to see whether it corresponds to centuries of slow aging rather than a few years of artificial baking. He checks for a faint hairline crack known from photographs of the Louvre painting. Within minutes, his mental checklist resolves into a verdict: yes, this is the missing panel. That decision is not an aesthetic sigh, it is a forensic conclusion backed by decades of handling similar works. Once authenticity is established, the energy in the room flips from curiosity to crisis management. Jerry and Poggy are no longer entertaining a strange visitor, they are holding a stolen state asset that has embarrassed France and fascinated the world for 28 months. They tell their guest what he wants to hear, that of course a purchase or reward can be arranged, that details will need to be discussed, but insist that, for safety, the painting should stay with them while arrangements are made. This plays directly into his hunger for institutional recognition. After 2 years of guarding the panel under his own bed, he wants the comfort of believing that grown UPS are now in charge. He agrees to leave the painting in the gallery and returns to his hotel, the modest Albergo Tripoli Italia, checking in under the alias Leonard V and imagining that the next knock on his door will usher in money, headlines, and a tidy narrative in which he is paid both in cash and in patriotism. As soon as he is out of sight, the gallery turns into a command post. Jerry drafts a telegram to the Florence police headquarters, the questura, that compresses the entire situation into a couple of crucial phrases. The possessor of the stolen Louvre Mona Lisa is in the city. He is using the name Leonard V. Please send officers discreetly. Telegraphy in 1913 is not instantaneous in the smartphone sense, but copper wires running along railway lines can carry this message across town in minutes. The wording does 2 technical jobs at once. By naming the Louvre, it signals to any clerk reading the wire that this is not a crank note about some provincial theft. By requesting discretion, it instructs the police not to trigger a public scene that might endanger the painting. At the questura, someone compares the alias to hotel registers, someone else begins assembling plainclothes officers, and a bureaucracy that has been entirely absent from the story suddenly spins into motion. That evening, around 9 o'clock, the police knock on the door of room 20 at the Albergo Tripoli Italia. Inside is a compact man in his early 30s, the hands of a tradesman, the anxious politeness of someone who is not yet sure which version of his story they have heard. The painting is not there, it is under guard at the gallery, but the trunk is, false bottom and all, along with travel papers and that December 1911 letter promising his father that, with one stroke, their fortune would be made. The questions are not dramatic, they are procedural. Where did you get the painting? How did you bring it here? Did anyone assist you? He admits that he is Vincenzo Perugia, admits taking the panel from the Louvre in 1911, insists that he acted alone, and begins to rehearse the patriotic explanation he has been building for years. For once, law enforcement has the rare luxury of matching the right person to the right crime with the object already recovered in good condition. Within a day, Italian and French authorities issue joint statements. The missing Leonardo is safe, in secure custody, and will be returned. Before it leaves, though, Italy takes a victory lap. In December 1913, the painting is briefly displayed at the Uffizi, where crowds gather in numbers that strain the building's 19th-century corridors. Newspapers describe Florentines queuing in winter coats to see the panel that, for centuries earlier, never actually hung in their churches but now feels like a prodigal child come home. Some papers hail its custodian as Illinois Patriota, the Patriot, even as others note the awkward detail of the attempted sale. Under guard, the panel travels to Rome, where it is shown at the French embassy and at the Galleria Borghese, then to Milan. Each stop is a choreography of crates, escorts, and inspection committees. The same object that had spent 2 years hidden in a trunk is now being handled with the care one normally reserves for explosive ordnance. Every movement is logged, every room it enters has guards. The contrast with its unalarmed hook in the salon car in 1911 could not be sharper. On the 31st of December, 1913, the painting is formally handed back to France. It travels by train to Paris in a specially prepared container, accompanied by guards and, if contemporary reports are to be believed, an atmosphere of almost ridiculous vigilance, locked compartments, curtains drawn, officials stationed in the corridor as if repelling train robber fantasies from the newspapers. When it arrives, experts examine the panel for damage or alteration and find none beyond the missing frame and glass. 4 days later, on Sunday the 4th of January, 1914, the Louvre rehangs the Mona Lisa in the salon car, now behind protective glass and with extra guards posted, and opens the doors. Contemporary accounts talk about riotous crowds. An estimated 30,000 people file past in a single day, jamming staircases and craning for a glimpse of a painting that, in 1910, had been a connoisseur's favorite rather than a mass pilgrimage site. The blank rectangle of wall that had shocked the copyist Louis Beroux 2.5 years earlier is now the focal point of something like national group therapy. Legally, the last major act of the story takes place 5 months later in a Florence courtroom. In June 1914, Vincenzo Perugia stands trial before Judge Giuseppe Sacchi. The hearing lasts a single day, but it condenses years of narrative into a few hours of argument. The prosecution has powerful artifacts: the December 1911 letter about our fortune, the trunk with its false bottom, the travel trail from Paris to Florence, the confession. Their theory is blunt: this was a theft for gain dressed up after the fact as patriotic restitution. The defense leans hard on the Napoleon story and on public emotion. On the stand, he claims he genuinely believed the painting had been looted during the French campaigns in Italy, that he wanted only to return an Italian masterpiece to its homeland, that any talk of payment has been misunderstood. Sacchi's written verdict tries to square this circle. It finds him guilty of theft, acknowledges mitigating circumstances of patriotism and prior honorable conduct, and sentences him to 1 year and 15 days in prison. An appeal in July trims that to 7 months. Because he has already been in custody since his arrest the previous December, he walks free shortly thereafter and will go on to serve in the Italian army during World War I before dying in 1925 at the age of 44. Trying to reverse engineer his true motive from this tangle is less like reading a confession and more like doing archaeology on a personality. What we can measure are the external traces: letters promising fortune, work records showing low wages, police transcripts describing life in a smoky room, trial rhetoric about national patrimony, press coverage that casts him alternately as buffoon, folk hero, and inconvenient embarrassment. What we cannot cleanly separate are the proportions of greed, resentment, and genuine, if misinformed, nationalism in his internal mix. Italian public opinion in 1913 loves the idea of an ordinary workman outwitting the Louvre and reclaiming a supposedly stolen treasure. French public opinion in 1914 prefers to see a security failure boxed off and punished. Courts like single, tidy motives, but this case refuses to collapse into one. Instead, it leaves us with a mechanically simple heist powered by a psychologically unstable blend of fantasy and grievance, a combination that security systems, then and now, are notoriously bad at modeling. When the crate carrying the painting rolls back into Paris at the very end of 1913, the French state stages something halfway between a homecoming and a stress test. The panel is unpacked in the Louvre, checked by experts who compare craquelure patterns, inventory stamps, and the wax seals on the back against earlier records, then slid into a new frame and given what, in 1913, counts as hard security, a glass cover and an unusually watchful guard. On New Year's weekend 1914 the doors open, and the building fills like a flooded basin. Contemporary estimates talk about 30,000 visitors on the main Sunday, bodies jammed in the Denon staircases, queues forming outside despite winter cold, police managing flow so people don't simply surge toward the salon car. For years earlier, the painting was one highlight among hundreds. Now, after 2.5 years of headlines, it's treated like a returning hostage. The museum has accidentally manufactured its first modern blockbuster show. Behind that spectacle, the lawyers have a more boring but equally consequential problem, whose courts get to process the thief. The crime took place in France in August 1911, against an object classed in French law as bien de la nation, part of the national collection. The suspect and the recovered property are in Italy in December 1913, in a Florentine hotel room that Italian police have every legal right to search. There is no Interpol, no cultural property convention, just 19th century extradition practices and two governments keen to avoid a public argument over jurisdiction. Italian prosecutors point out that transporting stolen goods across the frontier creates an offense under their penal code. Paris is quietly relieved not to have to put an Italian folk hero in the dock before a French jury. The result is a diplomatic algorithm that outputs, "Let Florence handle it," with a side order of patriotic theatre. The theatre opens in June 1914 in a modest courtroom where the air is probably warmer than the law. Judge Giuseppe Sacchi presides from a raised bench, reporters fill the back rows, spectators squeeze into any gap the ushers will tolerate. On one side, the prosecution lays out a very linear sequence: a 30-year-old decorator who once installed glass at the Louvre, a Monday closure day in August 1911, a painting removed from its frame and carried out under a white smock, more than 2 years of clandestine storage in a rented room on Rue de l'Hôpital St. Louis, finally, a trip to Florence under an alias and the meeting with antiquarian Alfredo Geri. They have documents: the December 1911 letter to Perugia's father promising that, with one stroke, our fortune will be made, the recruitment records showing him at the Louvre, Italian police reports describing the trunk and its contents. The defense has psychology and nationalism. Their script is simple. He believed the painting had been looted by Napoleon. He only meant to restore it to Italy. Any talk of money is embellishment. Saki's verdict is a masterpiece of judicial hedging. The court finds him guilty of theft and orders the painting formally returned to France, but the written judgment emphasizes mitigating circumstances of patriotism and his previously clean record. The sentence, 1 year and 15 days, sounds like real punishment until you look at the time already served since his arrest in December 1913. On appeal in July 1914 it drops to 7 months, effectively converting incarceration into a legal pause button. Within months he is out, and by autumn he is in uniform in the Italian army as Europe slides into total war. On paper the system has affirmed that stealing from a museum is still stealing. In practice it has signaled that, for certain categories of cultural crime wrapped in the right national narrative, jail can be negotiable. If you ever needed proof that courts sit at the intersection of law, politics, and vibes, here it is in one sentencing memo. Trying to reverse engineer motive from that paper trail is less like solving a puzzle and more like debugging someone else's firmware with only half the logs. We can count specific artifacts, the letter about a coming fortune, the trial transcript where he leans heavily on the story of Napoleonic pillage, the police interviews in which he describes hiding the panel in his cramped Paris room, the wording Sakai uses about love of patrimony. We can also count facts that flatly contradict his heroic narrative. Leonardo's move to France around 1516 at the invitation of Francis I. The painting's continuous presence in French royal and national collections for roughly 4 centuries, the total absence of any treaty listing it as spoils. Italian newspapers in 1913 still push the "stolen by Napoleon" line because it feels good. French papers oscillate between calling him an idiot and an emissary of Italian ingratitude because that feels good. Later historians, with access to court files and shipping manifests, mostly converge on a blended explanation: wounded pride and nationalist resentment wrapped around a very concrete fantasy of getting rich. Once the headlines drift away from his name, his life contracts quickly. After the short sentence and military service, he appears in records as a small businessman in the trades, running a decorating or painting firm, marrying, having a child. There is no second act as a celebrity thief, no memoir, no lecture tour. When he dies in 1925 at Fortefort, in a suburb near Paris according to some sources and back in Lombardy according to others, the event barely merits a line in the local press. The man whose white smock once exposed the Louvre's entire security model ends up buried like any other tradesman. The panel he carried, by contrast, is now on its own trajectory, across borders, through world wars, into a security architecture that will eventually involve bullet-resistant glass, microclimate control, and crowd barriers. One life drops back into statistical anonymity, one rectangle of wood becomes an object around which entire systems organize themselves. Those systems start reacting almost immediately. Inside the Louvre, an internal memo in January 1914 sets out a new regime. Key masterpieces will be placed in glazed, lockable cases. More guards will be assigned to the highest value works rather than spread thinly across entire wings. Staff and contractors will sign in and out with proper documentation rather than just a nod at the door. Galleries will run weekly object-by-object inventories instead of assuming that what hung there yesterday must still be present today. At the level of the French state, a historic monuments law passed in late 1913 tightens control over the export and movement of culturally significant objects, not just paintings but buildings, statues, and archaeological material. In physical terms, the response is screws, glass, and logbooks. In legal terms, it is new categories of national treasure and stricter penalties for smuggling. The theft has exposed an attack surface, and the bureaucracy is trying, belatedly, to patch it. The patch is not purely French. Museums across Europe and North America follow the story in newspapers and trade journals and quietly audit their own procedures. Directors in London, Berlin, and Boston ask awkward questions: who actually has keys to which rooms, how often inventories are verified, whether contractors are vetted beyond, seems fine. Conferences on museum practice begin to include sessions on alarms and insurance, alongside lectures on Renaissance iconography. In some institutions, guards stop being seen purely as ceremonial figures in frock coats and become part of a security system with radios, drills, and written protocols. There is no single Geneva-style convention triggered by the Mona Lisa, but when later international instruments on cultural property emerge in the mid-20th century, this theft gets cited in preambles and introductions as Exhibit A4, Why We Care. It is one of those cases that quietly migrates from the crime pages into the technical literature of heritage management. On the policing side, the stress test is equally instructive and embarrassing. The Paris police had, by 1911, adopted fingerprinting under the influence of Alphonse Bertillon, built out card indexes, and deployed technicians capable of lifting latent prints from glass and frames. What they did not have was a habit of actually cross-checking every print found at a crime scene against all the categories of people who might be relevant. Perugia's fingerprint card existed in their files from earlier minor infractions, but because the post-theft comparison was limited to current staff, his card never entered the search set. In modern database terms, their query had the wrong filter applied. The case becomes a training example in forensic textbooks. The mistake is not technological but procedural. In the decades that follow, police cooperation bodies, the International Criminal Police Commission in 1923, ancestor of Interpol, and later specialized art crime units, draw on such embarrassments to argue for broader data sharing and standardized alerts when major works go missing. The Mona Lisa theft is a quiet founding myth of the bureaucracy of stolen art. Meanwhile, the press keeps doing what it does best, turning structural failure into serialized entertainment. From August 1911 onward, Paris papers run front-page headlines announcing the disappearance, then the search, then any rumor that might fill a column inch. Cartoonists draw guards staring at a blank wall, columnists write about immigrant workers, decadent modern morals, or government stinginess, depending on which axe they happen to be grinding. After the recovery, the same fonts and column widths host a different mood. La jocundiste retrouve, our nation's smile returns, humiliation repaired. The word jocund turns into an adjective. People write about Jocondian mystery and jocund-like scandals. In London in 1913, when a famous pearl necklace disappears from a Bond Street jeweler, someone coins the phrase, the Mona Lisa of pearls, implicitly using the French theft as a metaphor for maximum glamour and embarrassment. Language itself has started routing other crimes through this one. As the decades go on, the story gets recycled into straight fiction. Novelists produce thrillers in the 1920s and 30s featuring stolen old masters and suave forgers whose biographies owe more to the dinner imagination than to the cramped boarding house on Rue de l'Hôpital St. Louis. In 1966, the Franco-Italian caper film On a Vol la Joconde turns the entire episode into a charming obstacle course, handsome thieves, witty guards, choreographed near misses, a Louvre that behaves like a nightclub with better lighting. The noisy, humiliating reality, the misfiled fingerprint cards, the yawning guards, the one-day trial that ends with a shrug, gets swapped out for genre satisfactions. It's a kind of epistemic laundering. Instead of systems fail because we underfund boring things like inventory control, the lesson becomes stealing masterpieces is glamorous. You can practically feel, in that aesthetic makeover, the human refusal to let a dull mechanism sit at the center of a good story. Artists pull off a different kind of theft. They steal the image and repurpose it. In 1919, Marcel Duchamp buys a cheap postcard of the painting, draws a small moustache and goatee over the famously ambiguous mouth, and adds the caption LHOOQ, a French sound-alike joke that is absolutely not classroom appropriate. Mid-century, Salvador Dali paints himself wearing her smile and writes essays about why people feel compelled to attack the picture. Andy Warhol screen prints grids of Mona Lisas until her face becomes as modular as his soup cans and Marilyn's. Decades later Banksy arms her with a rocket launcher in a stencil on a London wall. None of these works bother to retell the 1911 theft explicitly, but all of them lean on what it did, elevate the portrait from art historical object to world-famous logo. You do not give a moustache to some obscure court lady, you vandalize the icon that has already been turned into shorthand for art, capital A. Mass reproduction finishes what the thieves and journalists started. Cheap half-tone printing and postcard kiosks in the 1910s and 20s sent her face into cafes in Buenos Aires, onto chocolate boxes in Berlin, into department store catalogs in New York. Cultural historians like Donald Sarsoon point to the theft as the inflection point. Before 1911, the painting is important within the closed circuit of art criticism and connoisseur tourism. After 1911, it is a global brand. The phrase, Mona Lisa smile, only really escapes into general speech in the decades after the scandal, the words riding on posters and reproductions that owe their sheer volume to the attention the theft commanded. The Louvre participates enthusiastically, selling authorized images in its own gift shop while simultaneously investing increasing amounts of money in making sure nobody ever touches the original. The security architecture ends up two-tiered, a fragile, heavily defended poplar plank inside, an infinitely copyable image outside. The physical environment of the panel mutates with every scare. In 1956, two incidents, an acid attack in Montauban, when the painting was briefly exhibited there, and a visitor at the Louvre throwing a stone that chips paint from the lower left, convince curators that proximity is not a virtue. The museum installs a permanent glass barrier. Conservators begin monitoring temperature and humidity around the painting with the obsessiveness of intensive care physicians. By the early 21st century, the portrait sits in the salle des états inside a bespoke enclosure, multi-layer laminated, bullet-resistant glass, a controlled microclimate, alarms wired not just to the walls but to the mount, crowd barriers setting tourists several meters back. Each technical detail corresponds to a past injury or a feared scenario. Acid requires chemical-resistant glass, thrown objects require impact ratings, theft attempts require sensors that scream electronically long before a human guard can shout. Even with that technological cocoon, the painting continues to attract attacks in the symbolic layer, where the real target is public attention. In 1974, during a Tokyo exhibition, a protester sprays red paint at the glass to denounce the museum's treatment of disabled visitors. In 2009, a woman at the Louvre throws a ceramic teacup that explodes into shards against the casing while the panel itself doesn't even flinch. In the 2020s, climate activists discover that flinging cake or soup at the glass and unfurling a banner about fossil fuels produces instant viral video. The cameras are already there, the brand recognition is guaranteed, and the laminated glass will quietly do the engineering work of keeping Leonardo's paint intact. Security planners update their risk models to include performative attack on barrier, insurers adjust premiums, and somewhere can't survey to size and checks the seals again. The painting has become a lightning rod for grievances that have nothing to do with Renaissance portraiture. Zoom back out to the institution, and a pattern emerges that is almost slapstick in its consistency. The Louvre responds to humiliation by tightening procedures and hardware, then gradually relaxes back into confidence until the next shock. The Mona Lisa theft forces glass and inventories. The 1956 incidents force better barriers and conservation science, later thefts in other galleries, like the 2025 daytime raid in the Apollo Gallery where thieves used a basket lift and a broken window to grab pieces of the French crown jewels in under 10 minutes, escaping with tens of millions of euros worth of gems, reveal that while one room has become a fortress, large swaths of the building still live in an earlier security era. An audit after that raid reports that barely 2/5 of the museum's rooms are under camera surveillance, with planned upgrades repeatedly postponed. The painting at the center of our story is now probably safest among all objects on Earth. The rest of the collection still negotiates with budgets, politics, and human complacency. Around the edges of this very real institutional learning, myths breed like mold. In 1932, an American magazine publishes a long tale by journalist Carl Decker about a con man calling himself the Marquis de Valferno who supposedly hired Perugia as a patsy while selling 6 forged Mona Lisas to unsuspecting American collectors. It is a perfect narrative, a mastermind, a web of copies, rich dupes, a thief who doesn't even know he's part of a larger con. It is also almost certainly fiction. No court records mention Valferno, no dealers report handling the alleged forgeries. No lost Mona Lisa ever surfaces in a Palm Beach estate sale. Then there are the substitution fantasies, claims that the painting returned in 1913 is actually a copy and the real one is hidden in a vault somewhere. Against that stand incredibly boring but robust facts, the inventory stamp and wax seals Poggi checked in Florence, photographic comparisons of cracks and retouchings, layers of later scientific imaging. Evidence, as usual, is dull and stubborn, fantasy is agile and fun. So what does a small, stolen and recovered panel actually tell us about how humans build and break systems? At minimum, that institutions are very good at telling themselves that story is security, that nobody would dare, that prestige is armor, until some underpaid worker demonstrates otherwise with a screwdriver. It tells us that, once a failure is exposed, the response tends to focus on the last thing that went wrong, glass after a theft, thicker glass after stones, different protocols after a dual raid, while entirely new attack surfaces quietly form elsewhere. It shows how courts and newspapers compress messy motives into tidy archetypes, because opportunistic migrant with bad history textbooks and a grudge is harder to market than patriot or villain. And it shows how an object can slide, in a few decades, from being one painting in a crowded palace to being the focal point of global tourism, protest, satire, and security engineering. If you ever find yourself in front of her in the salle des états, wedged among hundreds of people holding up phones, you are looking at more than oil on poplar. You are staring at a crash log that the system decided to hang back on the wall. The glass, the barriers, the crowd control ropes, the guards scanning faces, they are all physical fossils of the 21st of August, 1911, of a Monday when a man in a white smock exploited gaps no one had bothered to close. The fact that you know her name, that you have seen her face on mugs and memes, is equally part of the fallout. The heist did not just temporarily remove a painting, it permanently rewired how we imagine art, museums, and risk. Every time someone leans in for a blurry selfie, the joke, quietly, is on the idea that some things are too important to be touched.